The ultrasound photo was still warm in Sabine's coat pocket, the way small important things feel warm when you keep touching them, and she was rehearsing the exact way she'd tell Roland. Casual, she'd decided she'd hand him the little gray printout upside down and let him figure it out. When she looked through the sliding glass doors of the QEII and saw her husband on the far side of the drop-off lane, with his hands spread flat against the small of another woman's back. A pregnant woman. He was helping her down from the passenger side of his truck, the way you help someone precious, one hand under her elbow, the other steadying the round front of her, and he was smiling up at her with a specific soft smile Sabine used to think belonged to her. He had told her that morning, over cold toast, that he had a sight walk in Bedford and wouldn't be reachable till supper. She stood in the vestibule between the two sets of automatic doors, the ones that never quite decide whether you're coming or going, and they kept opening and closing on her, letting the February cold in and out, and she did not move. She was 32 years old. She had wanted this baby for 2 years. She had a photograph of it in her pocket, the size of a bus ticket, and across a lane of salted asphalt. Her husband was buttoning another woman's coat over another woman's belly. You have to understand how ordinary the morning had been. That's the part nobody tells you. There's no music. Sabine had worked a night shift on the labor floor, had helped bring 3 babies into the world between 11 and 6, had peeled off her scrubs at the end of it feeling that specific bone-deep tiredness that is also, secretly, a kind of joy. She loved that work, loved being the calm hands in the worst and best hour of a stranger's life. And on her way out, she'd stopped at the little clinic on the 3rd floor, because she'd been queasy for a week and had finally let herself hope. The tech, a woman named Noor who'd trained with her, had gone quiet and then grinned and turned the screen. 7 weeks. A flicker. Sabine had cried, embarrassed, in the paper-lined chair, and Noor had squeezed her hand and said, "Go home, tell that husband of yours," and Sabine had gone down in the elevator, planning exactly that. And then the doors, and the truck, and the hand on the other woman's back. She did not go outside. She would think about that later, that her whole body, without asking her, simply declined to walk into that scene. She stepped back inside, into the antiseptic warmth, and she stood behind a pillar like a coward, or like a nurse, who has learned that you observe before you act. And she watched Roland walk the woman all the way to the maternity entrance, watched him press the button for her, watched the woman lean up and kiss the corner of his mouth, watched him go back to the truck, watched him drive off toward Bedford, toward the sidewalk, toward the lie. Sabine took the photograph out of her pocket and looked at it and put it back. Her hands were very steady. That was the strange part. On the floor, in an emergency, her hands went still and certain, and they did the same thing now. She walked back to the 3rd floor and she asked Noor, keeping her voice light, whether the woman who'd just come into maternity, cream coat, dark hair, about 8 months, was on the board, and Noor, who assumed it was nurse-to-nurse curiosity, checked and said, "Oh, that's a walk-in. Genevieve something. Husband's not listed, poor thing, came in alone." Came in alone, except she hadn't. She'd come in on Roland's arm. Sabine drove home to the little house in the North End that they'd bought together 6 years earlier. Back when Roland's company was 2 trucks and a dream, and she was covering the mortgage with her overtime. And she sat in the driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled, and she let herself understand it. All of it, in order like reading a chart. She and Roland had met when she was 24, not romantic the way they met. He'd come into the ER on a Saturday night, with a hand crushed between 2 loads of scaffolding, white-faced and trying not to swear in front of the nurses, and she'd been the one who held his good hand while they set the other one. He'd had nothing then. Grew up hard out in the valley, mother gone young, a father who drank the farm out from under them. He'd clawed his way to Halifax with a trade and a truck and a chip on his shoulder the size of the harbor. Sabine's family was the opposite. Her dad a retired dentist in Dartmouth, her mom the kind of woman who kept a cottage on the South Shore and a chest freezer full of blueberries she picked herself. Sabine's was an only child, loved to the point of spoiling, and she'd never once acted spoiled a day in her life. That was the thing people said about her. Kind, steady, gives too much. She'd given too much to Roland. She could see that now, sitting in the driveway. She'd bankrolled the early years. She'd co-signed the loan for the 3rd truck and the 4th. She'd worked doubles so he could take the risky bid that made his name. And somewhere in the last stretch, as the company got real and the money got real, and Roland started wearing better boots and taking longer meetings, he'd started coming home late, and she'd told herself it was ambition. She'd wanted so badly to believe it was ambition. She went inside and she did not scream, and she did not throw anything. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table where they'd eaten 10,000 suppers, and she waited for her husband to come home from a job site he had never gone to. He came in at 6:40 smelling like someone else's perfume, which is the oldest and stupidest tell in the world, and he kissed the top of her head and said the Bedford job was a nightmare. The surveyor had it all wrong, and Sabine looked at him and said quietly, "How far along is she, Roland?" She watched his face do the thing, the flinch, then the scramble, then the terrible instinct. She saw it happen, to lie again, and she held up her hand, palm out, the way she'd hold up a hand to stop a resident from doing something they'd regret. "Don't," she said. "I saw you at my hospital this morning, so don't." What followed was the worst conversation of her life, and she got through it the way she got through the worst hours on the floor, by narrowing everything down to the next true thing. Her name was Genevieve. She'd been a client, a kitchen reno out in the West End, and it had started 8 or 9 months ago. And yes, the baby was his, and this was the part that took the floor out from under her. He'd been paying for a second apartment for the better part of the year. The overtime money. Her overtime money, some of it, a whole second life, running underneath the first one like a basement she'd never been shown. And then Roland, God help him, tried to make it sound like a solution. He got down on one knee on the kitchen tile, which she would remember forever because it was the same knee, the same tile, where he'd once retied her boot laughing on a snow day. And he took her hands, and he said the thing that ended it completely. He said Genevieve didn't have to keep the baby's mother in the picture. He said they could pay her off after the birth, a lump sum, and bring the child home. He said, "You could raise it, Sabine. You always wanted one. This could still work for us." She looked down at him. She had told him nothing yet. She still had the little gray photo in her coat by the door, 7 weeks, a flicker. She did not tell him. She would never tell him. That was the first hard thing she took for herself. "I want a divorce," she said. "I want nothing from you. I want you out of this house by Sunday," he argued. Of course he argued. He'd built his whole self out of never losing, and Sabine watched him try every tool he had. Anger, then tears, then the terrible tenderness, and none of it moved her, because the thing he'd broken was not one thing. It was every day for 2 years, retroactively, all at once. When he finally went upstairs to sleep in the spare room, she sat at the table until the tea was stone cold, and then she went out to her car and drove to the harbor and parked facing the black water, and put one hand flat on her own stomach, and said, out loud to the flicker, "It's just going to be us, okay? That's all right. It's going to be just us." She should have gone straight home after that. She told herself later that she should have, but she'd wanted to see the apartment, the second one, the one her money had paid for. She'd wanted to stand in it and make it real, so it couldn't hollow her out later with doubt. Roland kept everything in a shoebox in the truck, receipts, a spare key on a fob shaped like a maple leaf, and she'd taken the key off the ring while he slept. So she went, not to confront anyone. She was very clear with herself about that, then and after. She went to look. To know. Genevieve was there. The building was one of those new glass ones on the water in Dartmouth, and Genevieve opened the door in a bathrobe with her hair down, huge with the pregnancy, and for a second the two women just looked at each other, the wife and the other one, and Sabine felt no anger, only a vast and terrible tiredness. She said, "I'm not here for a fight. I know everything. I just wanted to see it." But Genevieve was frightened, and frightened people are dangerous, and she started talking fast and loud, defending herself, saying Sabine had never really loved him, saying a man like Roland needed a woman who made him feel like a king, saying, and this was the part that made Sabine's ears ring, that at least she could give him a child, that Sabine after 2 years couldn't even do that. Sabine, who had a photograph in her coat pocket, said very quietly, "I could, I am." And she should have left then. She turned to leave. She had her hand on the door. But Genevieve, panicking now, thinking maybe that a pregnant wife changed everything, that Roland might choose the wife after all, grabbed Sabine's sleeve and yanked her back into the doorway, and Sabine, off balance on the polished floor in her winter boots, went down. It was not a dramatic fall. That's the thing about the falls that break you. Her hip hit the tile, then her shoulder, an ordinary awkward tumble, and she thought at first only that she'd bruised herself. She sat up, and then she felt it, a warmth, a wrongness, a pain low in her belly like a fist closing, and she looked down and saw the blood beginning, dark, spreading, and every single thing she knew as a labor nurse rose up in her at once and told her exactly what was happening. And there was nothing she could do about it lying on a stranger's floor. "The baby," she said. She didn't recognize her own voice. "No, no, no, please, the baby." Genevieve stood frozen with both hands over her mouth, and then a man came through the open door. His name was Desmond, and Sabine would not learn until much later everything he had already done and would do. But in that moment, he was simply a tall figure in a dark coat who dropped to his knees on the bloody tile without a flicker of hesitation and got an arm under her shoulders and one under her knees and lifted her like she weighed nothing, saying, I've got you, look at me, stay looking at me," and carried her out to a car idling at the curb and drove her to the QEII faster than she'd have thought that road allowed. She kept saying the baby. He kept saying, "Stay with me." She looked up once at his face, the streetlight sliding across it, and thought she half knew it from somewhere. And then everything went far away and gray at the edges, and she let it. They could not save the baby. The doctor who told her was gentle about it, and it was one of her own, a resident she'd taught, which was its own particular cruelty. And the words were the words Sabine had said to other women 100 times, and hearing them turned on her felt like standing in a room where all the furniture has been moved 6 inches to the left. The pregnancy had been early, the fall too hard, the bleeding too fast, her body already worn thin from the night shift and the shock. 7 weeks, a flicker, and then not. She was in a hospital bed on a floor 2 above the one where she worked. And when she surfaced from the anesthetic, the man from the doorway was still there, sitting in the vinyl chair by the window with his coat still on. And she looked at him and finally placed him, and it was so strange, she almost laughed. A year and a half earlier, on the maternity floor, Sabine had cared for a woman named Aveline through the longest, hardest night of that woman's life. A stillbirth at term, a little girl, everything ready at home and no baby to bring to it. Sabine had held Aveline while she screamed, and had washed the baby, and wrapped her, and brought her back so the parents could hold her. Because that is the mercy you can give. And she had sat with the husband in the family room at 4 a.m. while he shook. A big, quiet man too broken to speak, and she had said the only true thing there was, which was, "I'm so sorry, take all the time you need." She was beautiful. That husband was Desmond. Aveline had died 8 months after, an aneurysm, sudden, and Sabine had only heard about it secondhand and had sent a card. "You," she said, from the bed. "You held my daughter," Desmond said. "You were the only one there who treated her like a person and not a chart. I never forgot it." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry I couldn't get to you faster." She turned her face to the window and cried then. Finally, for the first time, not neatly, and he didn't try to fix it or fill it. He just moved his chair a little closer and stayed. Here is what she did not know, and would learn in pieces over the following weeks, that Desmond had not simply happened to be at that building. He owned it. He was a developer, harborfront properties, quiet money, the kind of man who sat on hospital foundation boards and never let his name be read out. He'd been there that night to check on a renovation, had heard a woman screaming through an open door, and had come running, and had recognized her, the nurse from the worst night of his life, on the floor. And in the weeks after, when Sabine left Roland with nothing but her clothes and her car, and a marriage worth of grief, a flyer appeared under her windshield wiper for a bright little 1-bedroom in the South End, at a rent that made no sense, and the landlord was easy and the lease was simple, and Sabine, exhausted, moved in and asked no questions. It was months before she understood that Desmond owned that building too, that he'd had the flyer made, that he'd quietly made sure the one thing she wouldn't have to fear was where she'd sleep. He never meant her to know. He only wanted her to have solid ground. But that came later. In the immediate after, Sabine went back to work, because working was the only thing that held her together, and she was good at it, and being good at something when everything else is rubble is a kind of salvation. She requested a transfer off the labor floor. She couldn't, not yet, maybe not ever, do the deliveries, and moved to the surgical recovery unit, where the joy was quieter, and the losses were older, and it didn't cut her open every shift. She got an apartment. She got a lawyer. She let the divorce grind forward. Roland tried, in the way of men who've lost the thing they thought they'd keep no matter what they did, to come back. Showed up at the apartment once with flowers and a speech. And Sabine, standing in her own doorway on her own solid ground, told him that Genevieve had left him the week the baby came, taken the settlement and gone back west, and that she hoped he understood now that he'd burned 2 houses down to warm himself for one winter, and she closed the door. He didn't come again, and Desmond was simply quietly there, not pushing. A coffee sometimes at the Tim Hortons near the hospital, where nobody looked twice at a nurse in scrubs and a man in a good coat. A text to say the ferries was running late if she was crossing to see her mom. He'd lost the person he loved most. She'd lost the future she'd been growing. They were 2 people who knew the exact weight of the worst thing, and it turned out that was a kind of language. She noticed the way he never once made her performance of being okay a condition of his company. She noticed that he remembered things, that she took her coffee with 2 milk no sugar, that she got migraines when the pressure dropped, that her mom's name was Ione and her dad had a bad hip. She noticed that when he laughed, which was rare and therefore worth a great deal, it changed his whole face. She fell in love with him slowly, the way you walk into cold water. And she hated it a little. Because loving anyone again felt like tempting the thing that took everything the last time. But he was patient in a way Roland had never been, and one evening on the boardwalk in a wind off the harbor that cut right through her good toque, she stopped and said, "I don't have anything to give right now, Desmond. I'm still all broken pieces." And he said, "I'm not asking you to be whole. I like the pieces." And she believed him, which was the beginning of everything. She would have liked the story to be simple from there. It wasn't, because it never is. The complication had a name, and the name was Solange. Solange had been Desmond's business partner for a stretch, years ago, sharp, ambitious, a woman who read a room like a balance sheet. And there had been a time when she'd assumed, and let others assume, that she and Desmond would eventually merge in every sense, the companies and the households both. When Desmond married Aveline instead, Solange had smiled and stayed a partner, and privately never forgiven it. After Aveline died, she'd circled back, patient as weather, waiting for the widower to need someone who understood the business, and she had genuinely believed her time had finally come. And then a labor nurse in a North End house, with nothing to her name, had walked into it, and taken the thing Solange had waited a decade for. Sabine met her at a foundation dinner, one of those events Desmond attended out of duty, and Solange was gracious to her face and vivisecting underneath it. Asked sweetly, in front of people, whether it must be strange dating a man whose late wife you'd nursed, whether Sabine ever worried she was standing in a dead woman's kitchen. Sabine, who had learned in 20,000 hard hours how to keep her face still, smiled and said she thought about Aveline every day and considered it an honor, and watched Solange realize she'd swung and missed. But Solange did not miss twice by accident. The thing Desmond was building that year was the biggest thing of his life. A redevelopment of a stretch of the waterfront that included a new wing for the children's hospital. The very floors where Aveline had lost her daughter, which was the whole point, which was the memorial he'd never spoken aloud. The financing was delicate, the city was involved, and donors, and a board that spooked easily. And confidential files began to leak. Projected costs distorted just enough to look like fraud. Private donor terms splashed to a reporter. A quiet suggestion planted that Desmond was using the hospital wing to launder something dirty. The board got nervous, the deal wobbled, and threaded through the whispers, always, was a second story. That the widower had been seduced by a scheming nurse who'd inserted herself into his grief, that she'd targeted him at his lowest, that she was after the estate. That one had Sabine's name on it. And Desmond's mother believed it. Cordelia was 71 and had buried a husband and a daughter-in-law, and had watched her son go gray and hollow. And she had exactly one thing left she cared about, which was Desmond. And she was not a cruel woman, but she was a frightened one. And frightened people, as Sabine well knew, are dangerous. Cordelia had been burned before. Years earlier, a woman had wormed into the family and made off with a great deal before she was found out. And so when the whispers reached her, they landed in the exact shape of her worst fear. She came to Sabine's apartment unannounced, sat very straight on the edge of the couch, and told her, not unkindly but with a terrible certainty, that she knew what Sabine was, that she'd seen women like her before, that she'd give her a check right now to disappear before she did to Desmond what the last one had done to the family. Sabine did not take the check, and she did not weep, and she did not slam the door. She made Cordelia a cup of tea, because that was what her mother would have done, and she said, "You're wrong about me, and I'm not going to convince you with words, so I won't try. I'll just keep showing up. That's all I can do." And Cordelia left unconvinced, and Sabine sat with the cold tea and understood that words were not going to be enough for anyone, not the board, not the mother, not the reporter. Someone had built a story about her out of true-looking pieces, and the only thing that would take it apart was truer pieces. So Sabine, who was not a naive woman, who had spent a career reading the small signs that told you what was really wrong with a body long before the body admitted it, started paying attention. She noticed that the leaks all traced back to documents that lived in one place. Desmond's office server, the one only the partners could touch. She noticed that Solange, at the last board dinner, had come back from the washroom by a route that took her past Desmond's private office. She noticed that the reporter's most damning detail, a donor term, had been changed in a specific way in a specific draft, and she knew which draft because she'd seen it on Desmond's laptop the night he'd fallen asleep on her couch, with the file still open, worrying about the wording. Only a handful of people had ever seen that draft. She did not go running to Desmond with a theory. She'd learned that a theory is worth nothing, and evidence is worth everything. What she did was this. She asked Desmond casually whether the office had cameras, and he said only the lobby and the server room for insurance. And she asked whether anyone reviewed them, and he said no one ever had. And so one gray Sunday, on the pretext of bringing him lunch, Sabine sat down at the security console in the quiet office, with the harbor going slate-colored outside the windows. And she went back through weeks of footage, hour by patient hour, the way you read a monitor through a long night, waiting for the one bad number. And she found it. Solange, after hours, letting herself into the server room with a card that wasn't hers, sitting at the terminal, working through passwords, copying files onto a drive she slipped into her coat. Timestamped. Clear. The whole architecture of the thing, laid out in grainy black and white. Now, this is the part the story could have gotten wrong, and Sabine did not. She did not confront Solange alone in some empty building at midnight to be brave. She'd read enough charts to know how those stories end. She copied the footage 3 times. She sent one copy to Desmond's lawyer and one to her own and kept one, and only then, with the ground solid under her, did she ask to meet Solange, and she asked to meet her in the most public place she could think of, the atrium cafe of the very hospital, on a weekday afternoon, with 2 lawyers at the next table, and her phone recording in her open bag. She went because she wanted Solange to understand it was over before it went any further, and because she wanted to look the woman in the face when she said so. She had a reason, and she told Desmond exactly where she was going and why, and he wanted to come and she said no. This part she needed to do standing on her own feet. Solange came expecting to win, she always did, and Sabine slid a still from the footage across the little cafe table, the timestamp legible, and watched the woman's face go from amusement to something older and colder, and said, "It's with 2 lawyers already. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you it's finished, and to ask you to leave him alone, because he has buried enough." Solange cornered, did the thing cornered people do. She got vicious, leaned in, and said low and precise all the things designed to cut. That Sabine was a nobody. That she'd lost her own baby on a bathroom floor like trash, and had crawled into a rich man's grief. To feel like something, that the file would sink Desmond and it would be Sabine's fault for pushing. And it did cut, all of it. But Sabine had stood in enough rooms, while people said unbearable things in unbearable hours. And she'd learned the trick, which is that you can hold still inside the cut and let it pass through you and out the other side. "You're probably right that I'm a nobody," she said quietly, "but I'm a nobody who has the footage, and you're the somebody who's on it." She stood up, gathered her bag with the recorder still running, and left Solange alone at the little table in the middle of the bright public atrium, which was, Sabine thought, exactly where the whole thing belonged, out in the open, in the light. The unraveling after that was quick. The lawyers moved. The board, shown the truth, closed ranks around Desmond instead of away from him, and the waterfront deal, the children's wing, the memorial he'd never named, got its footing back. Solange was removed from the partnership, and, when the leaked donor information turned out to cross a line the law cared about, removed from a good deal more than that. Last Sabine heard, she'd left the province entirely, and there was one small strange grace at the end of it. It was Roland, of all people, who supplied a last piece. He'd done a contract for Solange's firm the year before, a small reno, and he'd overheard things, and when Desmond's lawyer came asking, Roland, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because even a man who'd burned 2 houses wants to hold one honest thing at the end, told the truth on the record. Sabine never spoke to him, but she heard, and she let it sit in her, the smallest softening, not forgiveness exactly, but the acknowledgement that people are more than the worst day you saw them have. Cordelia came to the apartment a second time. She sat on the same edge of the same couch, and she was smaller than before, and she'd brought, absurdly, a lemon loaf wrapped in a tea towel, and she set it on the table between them, and did not know how to begin. Sabine put the kettle on, and Cordelia, in a voice that cost her a great deal, said that she had been shown the footage and the files and the whole shape of it, and that she had spent her life being wrong about the right things and right about the wrong ones, and that she'd watched Sabine choose, over and over, to protect Desmond in ways that gained her nothing, and that she was an old woman who owed a young one an apology, and hoped she wasn't too late to give it. Sabine poured the tea. She said, "You were protecting your son. I'd protect mine the same way." And something in the older woman's face broke open, and she reached across the little table and took the nurse's hand in both of her thin cold ones, and held on. They married in the spring, on the South Shore, in a white church near the water, with the wind coming up off the Atlantic, and everybody's hats trying to leave. Sabine's dad walked her down in his good suit with his bad hip and cried the whole way, unashamed. Her mom had made the cake. Cordelia sat in the front row in a dove-gray dress and dabbed her eyes with a linen handkerchief, and, when the minister asked who supported this union, said, "I do a beat before anyone else," and made the whole church laugh. Desmond, at the front, watched Sabine come toward him, with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The look of a man who had believed the good part was over and was learning, in real time, that it wasn't. When he took her hands, his were shaking. "You held my daughter," he said. "Too quiet for anyone but her." The same words from the hospital chair. "And then you held all the rest of it too." "I like the pieces," she told him, which was his line, and he laughed and it changed his whole face. She'd made her peace, mostly, with the idea that there might not be a baby. She was 33 by then, and her body had been through a great deal, and she'd worked hard to decide, that a life could be full without it. That she had a good man and a good mother-in-law, and a job that mattered, and a cottage they'd bought together, where you could hear the ocean from the porch, and that this was already so much more than the woman on the vestibule floor had thought she'd ever get again. So when the queasiness came back that autumn, she blamed the fairy, and then she blamed a bug going around the unit. And then one evening at the cottage, she'd barely gotten 3 bites of supper down when it rose up in her fast and certain. And she pushed back her chair and made it to the bathroom just in time. Desmond was at the door before she'd finished, knocking, saying her name, and when she came out pale and wrung out, he had his coat on already and the keys in his hand. "It's just a bug," she said. "Desmond, I'm a nurse. I'd know." He ignored her completely, which she'd learned was a thing he did exactly once a year, when it mattered, and he had her in the car and halfway to town before she stopped arguing, and he called ahead to a doctor friend, Sully, who groaned about his day off and was waiting for them anyway when they pulled in. Sully asked his questions and ordered his tests and went away with his face carefully blank, the way Sabine herself used to go away with her face carefully blank. And she knew that face. That was her own face. That was the face you wore when the number on the monitor was going to change someone's whole life. And you wanted to be sure before you said it. She sat on the paper-lined table swinging her feet, and Desmond held her hand too hard and neither of them breathed. Sully came back. He handed the printout to Desmond instead of to her, which she'd remember, and he said, "Have a look yourself." Desmond looked down, and Sabine watched her husband's face do the thing she'd been watching. Faces do her whole career. The widening, the disbelief, the rereading to be sure it was real. Except that this time it wasn't grief on the other side of it. This time it was joy, breaking over him like weather. And he made a sound she'd never heard him make and turned the printout around so she could see, pregnant. And there, on the gray, not one flicker but 2, twins. He lifted her off the table and spun her once in the little exam room, both of them laughing and crying. And she said, "Put me down." Everyone's staring, and it was true. Sully was staring, and a nurse in the doorway was staring, and Desmond looked around at all of them and did the least Desmond thing she'd ever seen him do, which was announce, to the whole surgical clinic, to strangers, at the top of his quiet voice, "We're having twins." And the room, which a heartbeat before had been full of people minding their own business, broke into applause. Sabine held the printout against her chest with both hands, the way you hold small important things, and thought of the woman in the vestibule with the doors opening and closing on her, and thought, "It's just going to be us." She'd promised the flicker, and here was the flicker, come back double, and here was the man who liked the pieces, and here was the whole ocean out the window going gold in the last of the light. What had felt, on a February morning between 2 sets of automatic doors, like the absolute end of her life, turned out to have been only the worst part of the road to it. She would tell the babies that someday, when they were old enough, not all of it, but the shape of it, that the ground can go out from under you completely, that the people who are supposed to catch you sometimes let you fall, and that even so, even then, if you keep getting up and keep choosing the next true thing, there are strangers who will kneel down on the bloody tile beside you without being asked, and stay, and carry you all the way to morning.